In 1942, the North Atlantic was a graveyard of twisted steel and frozen hopes. The Battle of the Atlantic was reaching a fever pitch, and for the crews of the German U-boats, the mission was as clear as it was perilous: sever the Allied lifeline to Europe. Among these vessels was U-210, a Type 7 submarine stalking the shipping lanes. In August of that year, after a relentless pursuit by Canadian naval forces, the U-boat was depth-charged and forced to the surface, where it was rammed and sunk. The survivors, plucked from the frigid, oil-slicked waters, expected the worst. Instead, they were the vanguard of an extraordinary social experiment they never saw coming. These men were transported across the ocean to a country of staggering proportions. Canada, safe from the falling bombs of the Luftwaffe, had been designated by the Allies as an ideal location for internment camps. Thousands of German soldiers, sailors, and airmen, eventually totaling nearly 35,000, were funneled into camps located in the remote bush of Ontario, the foothills of the Rockies, and the sprawling prairies of Alberta. For many, the initial shock of capture was replaced by a different kind of disorientation: the sheer hospitality of their environment. At Camp 133 near Lethbridge, Alberta, the prisoners found themselves in a facility that, while fenced with barbed wire, offered a quality of life that was rapidly disappearing in the Third Reich. Under the strict adherence to the Geneva Convention, the Canadian government provided food rations that often exceeded what German civilians were receiving at home. But the real shift in perspective didn't happen behind the wire. It happened in the fields. Due to a severe wartime labor shortage, the Canadian government implemented a program allowing low-risk prisoners to work on local farms and in logging camps. It was here that the ideological walls began to crumble. German submariners and infantrymen, raised on a steady diet of propaganda that depicted North Americans as uncultured and weak, found themselves sitting at kitchen tables with Canadian families. They shared meals, worked the harvest, and spoke of their homes. The prisoners saw a land of immense freedom and untapped potential, a place where a man was defined by his work rather than his party affiliation. As the war drew to a close in 1945, the atmosphere in the camps shifted from boredom to dread. News reached the prisoners of the firebombing of Dresden, the fall of Berlin, and the brutal occupation of Eastern Germany by Soviet forces. For those whose homes lay in what was now the Soviet zone, the prospect of repatriation felt less like a homecoming and more like a death sentence. They received letters from wives and mothers describing starvation and ruins. In their minds, the Germany they had fought for no longer existed. When the order for mandatory repatriation finally came in 1946, a silent crisis unfolded. Thousands of prisoners expressed a desire to stay, but the Canadian government was in a difficult position. These men were technically enemy combatants, and international law required their return. Furthermore, the Canadian public, still mourning the loss of sons and brothers killed in Europe, was not entirely ready to welcome the enemy as neighbors. Despite the official stance, hundreds of prisoners began a quiet campaign of resistance. Some went on hunger strikes. Others begged their former farm employers to sponsor them. There are documented cases of prisoners hiding in the woods or attempting to disappear into the vast Canadian wilderness rather than board the trains to the Halifax docks. They argued that they had become Canadianized, that their labor had contributed to the country's prosperity, and that they had more in common with the farmers of the prairies than the broken remains of the Wehrmacht. One particular incident involved a group of prisoners who, upon being forced onto a transport ship, had to be physically restrained. They weren't fighting for the Nazi cause. They were fighting for the right to remain in the land that had imprisoned them. They saw Canada not as a jailer, but as a sanctuary. Eventually, the Canadian government softened its stance. While a majority were sent back to Germany to participate in the reconstruction, a loophole was carved out. In the late 1940s, the government allowed former POWs to apply for immigrant status if they could prove they had a clean record and a guaranteed job. Thousands of those who had been shipped back immediately turned around and applied to return to Canada as legal immigrants. The irony of the situation remains one of the most poignant footnotes of the Second World War. Men who had been sent across the Atlantic to destroy the Allied cause ended up becoming some of Canada's most industrious citizens. They returned to the very farms where they had been laborers, married local women, and helped build the infrastructure of a post-war nation. They refused to go home because, in the silence of the Canadian prairies and the kindness of their captors, they realized they had already found a new one.